So, what is race? Race is a categorization of humans based on shared physical or social qualities into groups generally viewed as distinct within a given society. The term came into common usage during the 1500s when it was used to refer to groups of various kinds, including those characterized by close kinship relationships. The notion of a biological basis for race originally emerged through speculations surrounding the blood purity of Jews during the Spanish Inquisition. The Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492. In the 1800s, this recurring ideology was intensified in the development of the racial sciences, eugenics, and ethnology, which meant to further categorize groups of humans in terms of biological superiority or inferiority. While the field of racial sciences, also known as scientific racism, has expired in history, these antiquated concepts of race have persisted throughout the 21st century. During the Enlightenment, racial classifications were used to justify enslavement of those deemed to be of inferior non-white races, and thus supposedly best fitted for lives of toil under white supervision. These classifications made the distance between races seem nearly as broad as that between species, easing unsettling questions about the appropriateness of such treatment of humans. Basically, when European colonialism first began, they first made contact with these cultures and were in awe of them. They thought they were incredible, but they needed a justification for enslaving these people. So they had to say, okay, well, they're not the same species or subspecies as us. They're some other type of human, so similar to the way in Harry Potter, they'll have species like trolls and dwarves that are considered like on a level beneath humans and like exist only to serve them. That was really the whole reason that people created the idea of race to begin with, was just to use this as an excuse to say, oh, look, they're another race, so it's our destiny to lord over them. You could also say that the way humans like to put ourselves at the top of this period and say we're separate from animals or other living creatures, and it's our destiny to rule over them, and yet we're the ones destroying the planet. Again, it's just a justification used as an excuse for doing destructive things. In the West, the notion of ethnicity, like race and nation, developed in the context of European colonial expansion. By the 1800s, the term race began to refer to physical phenotypical traits, and then later to national affiliation. Like when you hear people talk about the German race, that's around this period when this started to become a thing. Modern science regards race as a social construct, an identity which is assigned based on rules made by society. This part is important when it comes to how race is defined and viewed in different countries, but I'm going to get into that in a different section. The concept of race is foundational to racism. While some researchers continue to use the concept of race to make distinctions among fuzzy sets of traits or observable differences in behavior, others in the scientific community suggest that the idea of race is inherently naive. Still others argue that, among humans, race has no taxonomic significance because all living humans belong to the same subspecies, Homo sapiens sapiens. Nazi racism posited the historical existence of national races such as the German race and the French race, branching from basal races supposed to have existed for millennia, such as the Aryan race, and believed political boundaries should mirror these supposed racial ones. As a result, there was a shift to discourage essentialist interpretations of ethnic groups and race. Ethnic groups came to be defined as social rather than biological entities. Their coherence was attributed to shared myths, descent, kinship, a common place of origin, language, religion, customs, and national character. So, ethnic groups are conceived as mutable rather than stable, constructed in discursive practices rather than written in the genes. So basically, when this first started with the Inquisition, it was because they wanted to get the non-Christians out, and they felt like this was a justified excuse. And then with colonialism, again, they could use this to their advantage as a justification for what they were doing. But then when during World War II, it was used to justify a Holocaust similar to what has happened in many cases with countless ethnic groups around the world. But just the fact that it happened in Europe, people really wanted to distance themselves from it. So that was really the turning point where people started saying, no, we're going to let that go. Basically, like, the issue with ethnic nationalism was that people like Hitler could say, beyond our own borders, in these neighboring countries, we have people who are ethnically German, and we need to unite them under one border so that we can all live in one country together. The difference between race, ethnicity, and nationalism, actually, what we don't realize is that these things really were synonymous at a certain point in time. And in cases like with Israel today, they are still operating on this same definition that we see being used during Nazi Germany, where they're using this ethnic identity as a justification for conquering the territory that they're starting in and expanding into territory in neighboring countries. Since the second half of the 1900s, race has been associated with discredited theories of scientific racism. It has become increasingly seen as a largely pseudoscientific system of classification. Although still used in general contexts, race has often been replaced by less ambiguous and/or loaded terms such as populations, people, ethnic groups, or communities, depending on context. According to the biological anthropologist Jonathan Marks, by the 1970s, it had become clear that 1, most human differences were cultural, 2, what was not cultural was principally polymorphic, that is to say, found in diverse groups of people at different frequencies. 3, what was not cultural or polymorphic was principally clinical, that is to say, gradually variable over geography. And 4, what was left, the component of human diversity that was not cultural, polymorphic, or clinical, was very small. A consensus consequently developed among anthropologists and geneticists that race, as the previous generation had known it, as largely discrete, geographically distinct gene pools, did not exist. In 1950, the UNESCO statement, The Race Question, signed by some of the internationally renowned scholars of the time, said, national, religious, geographic, linguistic, and cultural groups do not necessarily coincide with racial groups, and the cultural traits of such groups have no demonstrated genetic connection with racial traits. This is something that comes up a lot in the Creole community, where people assume that all Cajuns are white, all Creoles are black, all Cajuns speak French, all Creoles speak Creole. Not Exactly. When two different groups live in proximity to each other, lines are going to be blurred. In the US, the definition of race, as used for the purposes of the US Census, is not scientific or anthropological. It takes into account social and cultural characteristics as well as ancestry, using scientific methodologies that are not primarily biological or genetic in reference. Although commonalities in physical traits such as facial features, skin color, and hair texture comprise part of the race concept, this linkage is a social distinction rather than an inherently biological one. Other dimensions of racial groupings include shared history, traditions, and language. This is why when we look at these charts based on ancestry or genotyping, we see that there are people in different ethnic groups that technically have the same genetic makeup, but culturally they're different. And it's nobody's place to say you are not a part of the culture that you were born and raised in just because there's someone in another culture with the same genetic makeup. It happens. In September 1997, during the process of revision of racial categories previously declared by the OMB, the American Anthropological Association recommended that the OMB combine the race and ethnicity categories into one question to appear as race/ethnicity for the 2000 census. The interagency committee agreed, stating that race and ethnicity were not sufficiently defined and that respondents conceptualize race and ethnicity as one and the same, underscoring the need to consolidate these terms into one category, using a term that is more meaningful to the American people. The American Anthropological Association recommends the elimination of the term race during the planning for the 2010 census. During the past 50 years, race has been scientifically proven to not be a real natural phenomenon. More specific, social categories such as ethnicity or ethnic group are more salient for scientific purposes and have fewer of the negative racist connotations for which the concept of race was developed. Yet, the concept of race has become thoroughly and perniciously woven into the cultural and political fabric of the United States. It has become an essential element of both individual identity and government policy. Because so much harm has been based on racial distinctions over the years, correctives for such harm must also acknowledge the impact of racial consciousness among the US populace, regardless of the fact that race has no scientific justification in human biology. Eventually, however, these classifications must be transcended and replaced by more non-racist and accurate ways of representing the diversity of the US population. Race and ethnicity are considered separate and distinct identities, with a person's origins considered in the census. However, the practice of separating race and ethnicity as different categories has been criticized by both the American Anthropological Association and members of U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The recommendations of the American Anthropological Association were not adopted by the Census Bureau for the 2000, 2010, and 2020 censuses, but there is a shift to asking people to specifically identify their racial origins. So it says white is a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. And then once you put white, it asks specifically, what is your origin, such as Irish, German, Italian, Lebanese, Near Eastern, Arab, or Polish. If you put black, it's defined as a person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa. And then it asks you to specify origins such as African American, Kenyan, Nigerian, Haitian. A 1998 statement on race, composed by a select committee of anthropologists and issued by the executive board of the American Anthropological Association, says evidence from the analysis of genetics, for example, DNA, indicates that most physical variation, about 94%, lies within so-called racial groups. Conventional geographic racial groupings differ from one another only in about 6% of their genes. This means that there's greater variation within racial groups than between them. In neighboring populations, there's much overlapping of genes and their phenotypic, aka physical, expressions. Even though this quote says 94 versus 6%, I believe we all share 99% of our DNA anyway. So when he says 94 to 6%, he's talking about that 1% of DNA where we even find any variation between people at all. Small differences were found, but those were not based on race. They were from biological differences caused from the region in which people live. Society characterizes race as a set of physical characteristics. The clusters, though, have an overlap in physical characteristics and thus cannot be counted as a race by society or by science. While there is a biological basis for differences in human phenotypes, most notably in skin color, the genetic variation of humans is found not amongst, but rather within racial groups. Meaning, the perceived level of dissimilarity among the species has virtually no biological basis. Basically, if we had lived on separate planets for millions of years, yeah, we would have evolved into separate subspecies and there would be a biological race. But the fact is, these physical differences originally came from differences in geography, and geography changes gradually, and so do these physical differences. There is no distinct, definitive, objective cutoff where you can have like a universally agreed upon scientific definition. It's very hard to know where to draw the lines because it's really just different groups of people deciding for themselves where to draw the lines. Only a few genes are responsible for someone's skin color and traits. A person who is considered white may have more African ancestry than a person who is considered black, and the reverse can also be true about European ancestry. Race is a powerful force in everyday life. These races are not determined by biology, though. They are created by society. There are not any genetic characteristics that all blacks have that whites do not possess, and vice versa. As anthropologists and other evolutionary scientists have shifted away from the language of race to the term population to talk about genetic differences, historians, cultural anthropologists, and other social scientists reconceptualize the term race as a cultural category or identity. Many social scientists have replaced the word race with the word ethnicity to refer to self-identifying groups based on beliefs concerning shared culture, ancestry, and history. A 2021 study that examined over 11,000 papers from 1949 to 2018 in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that race was used in only 5% of papers published in the last decade, down from 22% in the first. Together with an increase in the use of terms ethnicity, ancestry, and location-based terms, it suggests that human geneticists have mostly abandoned the term race. Even in medicine, researchers point out that finding a difference in disease prevalence between two socially defined groups does not necessarily imply genetic causation of the difference. They suggest that medical practices should maintain their focus on the individual rather than an individual's membership to any group. They argue that overemphasizing genetic contributions to health disparities carries various risks, such as reinforcing stereotypes, promoting racism, or ignoring the contribution of non-genetic factors to health disparities. International epidemiological data show that living conditions rather than race make the biggest difference in health outcomes, even for diseases that have race-specific treatments. Some studies have found that patients are reluctant to accept racial categorization in medical practice. Probably because of medical racism. Regardless of the name, a working concept of subspecies grouping can be useful because, in the absence of cheap and widespread genetic tests, various race-linked gene mutations such as cystic fibrosis, lactose intolerance, Tay-Sachs disease, and sickle cell anemia are difficult to address without recourse to a category in between individual and species. As genetic tests for such conditions become cheaper, and as detailed haplotype maps and SNP databases become available, identifiers of race should diminish. Also, increasing interracial marriage is reducing the predictive power of race. For example, babies born with Tay-Sachs disease in North America are not only or primarily Ashkenazi Jews, despite stereotypes to the contrary. French Canadians, Louisiana Cajuns, and Irish Americans also see high rates of the disease. Racial recognition is not actually based on a single trait like skin color, but rather on a number of characteristics that are to a certain extent concordant and that jointly make the classification not only possible, but fairly reliable as well. Forensic anthropologists can classify a person's race with an accuracy close to 100% using only skeletal remains if they take into consideration several characteristics at the same time. But knowing someone's race does not provide comprehensive predictive information about biological characteristics and only absolutely predicts those traits that have been selected to define the racial categories. For example, knowing a person's skin color, which is generally acknowledged to be one of the markers of race or taken as a defining characteristic of race, does not allow good predictions of a person's blood type to be made. Basically, you could say my definition of race is going to be based on eye color and whether your second toe is longer or shorter than your big toe. And you could successfully identify who is a member of each racial group based on just a skeleton if I give you my parameters, but it still tells you nothing about the person. It doesn't tell you their blood type, their demeanor, like their personality, overall health, their intelligence. In general, the worldwide distribution of human phenotypes exhibits gradual trends of difference across geographic zones, not the categorical differences of race. In particular, there are many peoples like the San of Southwest Africa or the people of Northern India who have phenotypes that do not neatly fit into the standard race categories. Focusing on race has historically led not only to seemingly insoluble disputes about classification. For example, are the Japanese a distinct race, a mixture of races, or part of the East Asian race? And what about the Ainu? Its use in genetics was formally renounced by the US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in 2023.